Bow your heads, please.
Dear Jesus, I thank you for this wonderful day that we can all be here and learn about your creation, all the things you made, all the plants that you made. I pray that you would just keep my dad safe today. He's operated on. I pray that you would just give the doctors wisdom and skill, and that they would know exactly what to do, that nothing would go wrong. And Mr. Ray should have a safe drive home. In Jesus' name.
Amen. Thank you very much. Okay, so we're on page 429. And we are looking at Kingdom Plantae for the next 3 weeks, and we started last week. We started to look at the anatomy and a classification last week. What did we call the study of plants?
Botany.
Good, botany. And if a plant only lives for 1 year, what do we call it? Annual. So if it's lucky and lives for 2 years, what do we call it? Biennial. Good. And if it's like a tree that lives many, many years, what do we call it? Perennial. Very good, perennial. Excuse me, if we are looking at the flowers, seeds, and fruit, what type of organs are we looking at? Reproductive organs. So if we are looking at the stems, roots, and leaves, what are we looking at? Vegetative organs. Then we said that there were 4 different types of tissues in a plant. The tissue that is responsible for support, photosynthesis, storage, making proteins, metabolism. What type of protein was, what type of tissue was that? Ground tissue. So the vast majority of the plant is ground tissue. What about that one single layer on the outside edge? What kind of tissue is that called? Dermal. Good. What about the tissue that is not yet decided what it's going to be when it grows up? Meristematic. Good. And so that's undifferentiated because it's not different yet. It hasn't decided on one particular function or another. Excuse me. And then, everybody do this with me. The vascular tissue is made up of the xylem and the phloem. Good job. Okay. And so we're going to get into that more today. So then we looked at leaves, and I brought some pretty weird leaves last week, so I didn't bring you leaves today. But we saw that the main portion of the leaf is called what? Blade. Good, the blade. And then the stem between the stem of the plant and the blade, what do we call that?
Petiole.
Petiole, very good. The little covers that used to be over the leaf before it came out are called what? Stipules, good. And then the very edge of the leaf, on the outside edge, is called what? Apex, very good. And so we're supposed to know those parts of the leaf. And then on page 432, we saw that if there's one leaf per petiole, it's a simple leaf. If there's multiple leaves per petiole, we call it a compound leaf. And then, what do we call the very edge of the leaf? There's a name that we call the edge. Margin, good. The leaf margin is the edge of the leaf. If the edge of the leaf looks like a steak knife, so it has little bitty teeth in it, what do we call that? Serrate, just like a serrated knife, serrate. If it is choppy enough that it looks like it has teeth, what do we call that? Dentate, because it looks like teeth. If it's wavy, what do we call it? Undulate, good. And then if there's nothing to it at all, it's just a line, what do we call it? Entire. So you need to be able to identify the leaf margins. And then the way the leaves are distributed on the stem so that they can catch light is the mosaic. So that's how it's arranged on the stem. If it's arranged in a circular pattern like the Schefflera that I brought in last week, what kind of arrangement is that? World. If they're directly across from one another on the stem, what do we call that? Good. And if they go like this, alternate. Very good. You need to know that. On page 433, we learned the common shapes of the leaves. If it was long and thin, it's linear like a line. The elliptical was kind of long, but it tapered at either ends. And then there's the oval. These are on your test. And I'm going to tell you right now, on your test, he's going to give you some leaves. And then you're going to say what the shape is. You're going to say what the margin is. And you're going to say what kind of venation it has, which are the veins. okay? And that's going to count for a large portion of your test because he gives you several of them. Let's say he gives you 4 or 5 of them, and each one has 3 answers to it. Get the drift? So that's a lot of your test, isn't it? So don't just blow by this and not pay attention to it. It's heavily weighted on your test. So make sure that you can answer these shapes to the best of your ability. If you can justify your answer, you know, we'll talk, okay? Because I'm going to tell you right now, some of the margins on once they've been done on the computer, even though they're supposed to be one type, may look like another type. Do you see what I mean? So just make sure you answer, and I'll be fair, and we'll get, you know, credit where you answer that could be justified with what you've learned, all right? The last thing you have to do, and I already mentioned, was the venation. And so if you'll turn the page, on page 434, oh, we didn't do one. We went over the rounded teeth on the leaf margin was the crenate. And sorry, I crenate, I'm so sorry, crenate. And I skipped that one. And I apologize for that. So if you have rounded teeth, they're crenate. Now the venation on the bottom, I want to be very clear on this because when you consider how many of them you have to answer it on, I want to make really sure you can answer those questions. So remember, if all of the veins go in the same direction as the midrib, and remember the midrib is the main vein that comes off of the petiole. So if they all run in the same direction as the midrib, what do we call that kind of venation? Parallel. Good. If the midrib comes in off of the petiole and the only other veins you see come off of that midrib, then what do we call it? Pinnate. If you have the midrib coming in, and let's say you just have this, but if you see any other veins coming off of that, it's palmate. So it doesn't have to split like the palm of your hand. It's just if there's any other veins coming off of a vein that comes off of the midrib, you would classify that as palmate. So everybody understand? Because there might only be a few little pieces coming off, but if you see that, you know that it's palmate. If you just see veins coming off the midrib, you know that it's pinnate. The parallel is the easy one, isn't it? And then we also briefly discussed that monocots have 1 seed leaf, dicots have 2 seed leaves, and monocots have parallel venation in their leaves, whereas dicots have netted venation in their leaves. And so that was one of the differences. And in your study guide, you had to come up with some differences. And on your test, you're going to have to come up with some differences. So this is a really easy difference, isn't it? That the veins differ, okay? Another difference that we did talk about briefly was that the roots are different. That usually monocots have fibrous root systems, which look more like a bush underground, whereas dicots usually have a taproot system. What does a taproot look more like underground? Carrot. Looks more like a carrot, doesn't it? Exactly right. Okay. So then we did not do the leaf collection, but you're welcome to do that. And then on page 436, I would suggest you look at some leaves, though, and try to identify them before you take your test so that you're ready for your test. So you might want to walk through your yard and try to identify some of them. The only drawback is you don't know if you're wrong, huh? So you may want to carry your book with you. Anyway, we saw the cross-section of the leaf, and in the cross-section, we saw the different types of cells that were in it. Remember, what's the job of the leaf? What's the main purpose of the leaf? Good. Photosynthesis. Its job is actually to make food, to make glucose. And that can be stored in the form of starches and other places in the cortex of the stem or of the root. But its job, the food factories of the plant, God bless you, are actually the leaves. So, God bless you. The photosynthetic cells are found in the parenchyma, and I don't know where these names come from or who they, I'm sorry, I just didn't come up with them. But in the parenchyma, I ask that question a lot in anatomy. In the parenchyma, we have the palisade mesophyll and the spongy mesophyll. Now remember, the palisade mesophyll packed tightly together like a palisade fort. Why? Why is it so tightly packed together there?
Oh.
Yes?
So you can have more chlorophyll.
Good.
Cells, more chlorophyll.
Good. More photosynthesis going on. And so the hope is that you have more chloroplasts, and remember those chloroplasts are actually circulating around so that they can catch the sunshine and do the photosynthesis. What about, why is the spongy mesophyll so loosely packed? Why is that important?
It's on the bottom of the leaf.
It's on the bottom of the leaf, but there's a reason why it's so loosely packed.
So it can release.
So to circulate the oxygen.
Thank you. Gas exchange. You must have gas exchange to have photosynthesis. And if it's all packed really tightly together like the palisade mesophyll, you're not going to be able to have gas exchange. So it is usually on the lower side of the leaf because the top side is palisade mesophyll. It looks darker so that it can get more photosynthesis going on where the sun's hitting it. The underside is usually lighter looking because it's got the spongy mesophyll there and the gas exchange. What do we call the holes that the gas goes in and out of? I like to call them the nostrils of the leaf, but what do we call the holes in the leaf that the exchange goes in and out of?
Stomata.
Good, the stomata. And what cells open and close the stomata? Guard cells. Very good. And the epidermis job was for protection. And then there was parenchyma cells that actually give support to the vascular tissue within the leaves. And remember, vascular tissue is the xylem and the phloem that's carrying the nutrients in. The xylem would be carrying in, so that'd be water and minerals. And then the phloem would be carrying out of the leaf, so that would be what we would think of as maple syrup or the organics, sugars and things like that. Okay, so then we got over to page 439 and saw some really pretty leaves. And we saw that leaves don't have to be green, but if they're green, what is the pigment that makes a leaf green? Chlorophyll. Good. And then if they look more of a yellow or an orange color, does anybody remember that pigment? Good. Carotenoids, and it looks like carrot. So if it looks like carrot and then you put an oids at the end, you're probably really close. Carotenoids. There's that carrot in there. And then we played with red cabbage juice last week and did the different pHs, and we saw that the pigments in the red cabbages are pH sensitive and could give you green, blue, purple, and pink, depending on the pH. Does anybody remember what those pigments are called? Good. Anthocyanins. Very good. And the anthocyanins, so all of those, remember guys, are pigments. And not all of the pigments are green. And that's why leaves can have so many odd colors. And the leaves that you see on the top of page 439 that are all the pretty colors in the fall, what do those trees have in common that make those leaves die? They are deciduous trees. Very good. Deciduous trees lose their leaves once a year when the sunlight gets shorter, the days get shorter. But what do they have structurally that cause them to be deciduous? Good. The abscission layer. Don't forget that. The abscission layer actually cuts off the connection between the stem and the petiole, so that you're literally cutting off the vascular tissue. It no longer is getting the water and minerals from the xylem. It's no longer sending out the organics from the phloem. It's been cut off. And so in the process, that leaf dies. And we said that if your fall was cold and sunny, that you could get all these very cool colors because of the chemistry that was going on in the leaf. It was being cut off, and it would give you the different pHs, and you would get the anthocyanin giving you all these pretty colors. Whereas if it was a cloudy, not as cold climate, that it might have less dramatic leaves. So we talked about that last week, and that deciduous trees all have to have an abscission layer. So do most conifers have abscission layers? Now, I'm applying something you're supposed to know from this week. What's a conifer? Cone-bearing trees. So most of us would think of pine trees or Christmas trees. Do they have abscission layers? No, they do not, because most of us think of those as evergreens, don't we? And I think the vast majority of conifers are evergreens. So I say that because I'm sitting here wondering if cypress trees are a conifer. And certain cypress trees are deciduous. So I don't want to say all of them are that case, but I know most conifers, like your pine trees and any of your evergreens, are lacking abscission layers. And that's why they're not deciduous. Okay. And remember, that was to help them from dehydrating during the wintertime because there would be less water around during the wintertime. Then on page 442 and 443, we started looking at roots. And we said that roots were for absorbing the water and minerals, for attaching the plant to something, and for food storage, which is why we like the roots, because we like to eat the roots. Well, we eat things like carrots or beets or turnips if you're into it. But anyway, and so if you've never had turnips, they can be very good. I just want you to know that. It's just most people have never had turnips. I have realized that. I'm being from the deep south and my daddy being from Georgia. I have had turnip greens with turnips cut in them and cornbread, and it's really very good. So, just so you know. But I like raw vegetables better, I've decided. They snap back, so they're more fun. Anyway, except for taters, I like my taters cooked, precious. And that's better that way. Okay, and remember that the potato's not a root, so we don't want to let it go into that category. We did talk about the fact that the roots of the tree actually make up more, if you put surface area-wise, than what's above the ground, because the idea is that it's under there doing absorption, and so that's very important. And I don't know if you remember, but way back when we studied fungi, we talked about that the mycorrhizae was actually a symbiotic relationship between a fungus and the roots of the plants, so that the fungus actually extends the surface area of the plant, and in exchange it gets nutrients from the root cells, but the root benefits because it's an increased surface area, so it benefits by the more absorption that can occur. And so we talked about that a long time ago. On page 444, we looked at the cross-section of a root. If the root's here, we cut it longwise, and we saw that in the cross-section of the root, the lowest portion, which is actually growing through the dirt, or whatever it's growing through, is dead, and it's the root cap, and so that's thick-walled dead cells. Right behind that is the undifferentiated portion, and so what kind of tissue did we call that, and that region is called? Good, the meristematic region, very good. And that's undifferentiated, and that's what we looked at when we looked at the onion cells in mitosis. And then behind that, we look at the elongation region, and there it's beginning to differentiate and it's stretching out. And then above that, we are looking at the maturation region. There it's fully differentiated. Root hairs are coming out of it to absorb water, etc. Okay, then on page 445, we looked at the cross-section of a root. So now we've taken the root long ways and we've cut it sideways and we've looked at it like this. It's like taking a carrot and cut it in half. So we've put it up and looked at it sideways. We see that when we do that, the epidermis is the outermost edge, and once again, that's dermal tissue. I think the endodermis is also dermal tissue, and that's the part that's on the right-hand picture surrounding the vascular tissue. The cortex is the storage portion in between the epidermis and the endodermis, and that would be ground tissue because that's for storage purposes. And then the endodermis is protection for the vascular tissue, and inside that you have the X, which is the xylem, and then the small parts in between the legs of the X, which would be the phloem. Then you have the pericycle mentioned there, which is actually undifferentiated and branches can start from there, forming new roots and stuff. And then you have the vascular cambium, and that can grow into xylem or phloem as the root needs. And what I'm noticing is this word cambium. Whenever you see that word, from what I can understand, what I've looked at another book to try to get a better feel for this. Cambium, you should think meristematic tissue. So if it's vascular cambium, it's meristematic tissue that's going to turn into xylem or phloem. If it's cork cambium, it's meristematic tissue that's going to turn into cork, which is going to be bark, right? So just when you hear cambium, think that it's going to turn into something. All right, back to where we're supposed to be. Page 446. We're looking at stems. And you guys are all aware that stems can be wimpy, you know, where it's like a herbaceous stem and you grab it and it goes, you know. And I think he calls those prostrate stems because they lay sideways. And then you can have erect stems, which would be more what we think of as roses and things like that. And then you have climbing stems, which would be like vines, ivy, bean plants. Okay. And then you have subterranean stems, which are under the ground, which would be potatoes, precious, okay? And so some of them actually grow under the ground. I like my taters, can you tell? I like French fries. I like taters. Anyway, okay, I know I'm a bad person. So then he tells us there are 3 basic functions to plants, to the stems of the plants, that they can be for support, that they can manufacture food. They can also store food, can't they? They manufacture through photosynthesis, but they can store food. But I think personally, probably the most important thing a stem does is it conducts the water up and the water minerals up and the nutrients down from the leaves. Without that, the whole tree dies, or the whole plant dies, doesn't it? So yes, it does a little bit of photosynthesis. Yes, it does a little storage, but that whole vascular thing becomes extremely important. So it's got at least these 3 functions. Now he mentions here herbaceous stems, and then he mentions woody stems. And remember, the herbaceous ones are the ones that are either annuals or biennials, because if a herbaceous stem continues to grow, it will crack open, and I'm an animal person, so in my mind it bleeds to death. The plants don't bleed to death. So what it actually does is when it cracks open, then pathogens like bacteria and stuff can get in, the water and stuff, and the sap, which is the blood of the plant, right, goes out. That's why I said it bleeds to death. Anyway, and so the plant doesn't do well and it dies. And that's why herbaceous plants are inherently smaller, and they're not, they just don't have that protection. Whereas a woody stem is able to put the cork around it in bark, and as it grows, the bark just cracks and it continues to put more cambium, lays down more bark inside of it, and so it can continue to grow year after year after year. So that's your basic difference between woody and herbaceous, is the woody doesn't bleed to death because it's growing, and therefore it can be perennial. Okay? Now, on this picture, I did, like I said, I pulled out another textbook and got a little extra because plants not my forte. Sorry. Like to eat them, like to look at them, like them around, but not my forte. So I was looking at this, and first off, when you look at the picture of the herbaceous stems, I already told you that on the Dicot, you need to, he's going to have pictures on your test, and the Dicot, the big difference between Dicots and Monocots on the herbaceous is where the vascular bundles are, right? On the, let's do the Monocot first. On the Monocot, I'll put the word, there you go. On the Monocot, the vascular bundles are distributed throughout, aren't they? They're all through the stem, aren't they? Where are they at on the Dicot? Only around the outside edges. So you know what, how you could remember this? I know I'm a really sick, twisted person. Dicot looks like a donut, doesn't it? Dicot looks like a donut. D&D. Dicot donut. And it does look a little bit like a donut, doesn't it? The other thing is, remember when we look at these fibrovascular bundles, he points out in the book, I know we haven't gone over them yet, but I'm just going to point this out now, that he says the fibrovascular bundles, so if we focused in on one of these, the picture in your book has it going like this, sort of like this, right? And he says that looks like a monkey face. And I don't know about you, hey, it was in the book. I didn't come up with that. And I looked at that and I go, where's the monkey face? But if you take this and you spin it around so that the dots are up here and the other part is here, there's the monkey face. You got to take your book and turn it over. Yeah, it's his mouth and its nose and its eyes and its little, I don't know, forehead. If you don't see it, it's okay. But you do have to be able to identify the difference, because the xylem, and this is the other thing, he kind of points this out, but I didn't realize this. This is your fibrovascular bundle, the little monkey face, in the monocot. In the dicot, it's got the xylem is a little bigger and the phloem is a little smaller, but it's just kind of like this, isn't it? Right? Comparatively. Artists, I'm not, so you art people, please forgive me. Okay? The trick is this. That's the phloem in here, excuse me, the xylem in here, the bigger holes. is always the xylem. This is what I'm learning. The bigger holes is always the xylem.
So both of the bigger...
Always, the bigger holes are going to be your xylem in whatever vascular tissue you're looking at in a root or a stem. Okay? And I think this is going to make more sense in a minute, because see, the xylem tends to be more like straws. And you can pull liquid up in a straw all day long and it doesn't have to be alive, can't you? Right? But the phloem, and so xylem doesn't have to be alive, so it tends to get bigger and it's like a straw. The phloem has to be alive, even long term, because think about the phloem's job. Now, I just made this picture. Xylem. You can take a straw and put it in any liquid and pull it up, and no problem. I can get it up. And the straw's not alive. No problem. But the phloem has to be alive, and it has to be smaller, because the phloem is carrying the stuff down from the leaves. What if you're looking at a 20-foot tree? Now, I know you haven't done physics yet, but maybe you remember physical science. The acceleration due to gravity is 32 feet per second squared. So if it's 20 feet high, that's 20 times 32 feet per second squared. If it was allowed to just free fall, it would be blasting out the bottom of the root, wouldn't it? Boom! Root aneurysm, right? Okay. And so it wouldn't be good. Think about it. You know, I never thought about it until I studied this. And I went, oh my gosh, yeah, that makes sense. You can't just let it free fall from the top of a tree. You know, everything dies. And let's be honest, then the nutrients aren't getting distributed to the cells along the way that it's supposed to be feeding, right? So what I'm noticing is when you look at these pictures, the xylem looks big because it's straws. Straws. But the phloem is small because not only does it have to limit the as it comes back down, it wants to limit the speed with which it comes back down in the acceleration. It also is actually alive so that it can participate in distributing those nutrients as it goes down and slowing it down. Okay? So you have to be able to identify that. If you've ever broken off an herbaceous dicot, you've probably noticed some stems like this, haven't you? Where it broke off and it was kind of circular in the middle, it had a hole in the middle. Yes, sir?
Like celery,
yeah. Immediately the thing that comes to my mind, but it's not a good picture, is bamboo. But bamboo's a monocot. And so if it was living, the bamboo was living, because think about it, by the time you see bamboo and it's dead, right? But when it's living, it would look like this. But it apparently lays down what's called a rind around the edge. And so that's why it's hard after it dies, because the rind is still in place. But you've probably broken off a branch at some point in time and seen, and this is the pith, which is, apparently it's a, when it's still there and it's not hollow, it's like a softer area that just stores water. I got some of you actually know what I'm talking about. This is amazing, because I just read up on this, so I could tell you this. But the pith is an area that it stores water when it's growing, and then as it continues to grow and it takes out the water and doesn't need it anymore, it just makes a hole that's left behind. And I guess that's why you probably had something before that your mom said, oh, that's pithy. You know, if she ate it and she said, oh, it's pithy, which means it's got a weird texture to it. It's not what she wanted. That's what she's saying. She's not happy. Anyway, not if she says it's pithy. And so the pith, it talks here that it'll often turn into a hollow area in the stem. So you need to be able to identify the fibrovascular bundles in a monocot. Have the monocot monkey face. Just look for the little face looking thing going on here. And the dicot stem looks more like a donut. So this is evenly distributed, whereas this is around the edges. And the fibrovascular bundles actually look different in these two. Yes, sir?
If woody stem was a dicot, like, would that be why like some big trees have are hollow inside and animals live in them?
Oh, there's a good question. Actually, when animals live in the holes in trees, they still have other areas that go around it, or the tree dies. So we'll talk about that in a minute.
But I'm saying could because there's the pith in the middle, and it could like go away. Would that help?
That's a good question, John. I can't answer that. I don't know, and I'm sorry. That's a very good question. And I have seen holes in trees where critters live, to my sometimes not happy finding possums in them and stuff, So. Can you eat the pith? Oh, there's a good question. Well, I know in I know in carrots I eat the pith. Have you ever had a carrot and you broke it open and the part in the center comes out? Yeah. But that's a root. That's not a. But you know that's that vascular tissue in the middle.
But like I don't know. There's like this thing that comes in a can. It's palm hearts.
Oh, it's palm hearts.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I don't think that's pith. You know why? Those are monocots.
Okay.
All palms. Think about how their leaves look. They have parallel venation, don't they?
Okay.
And so those are actually monocots. All your palms are monocots. Think also about a coconut. It's a single seed leaf. You can't break it open in two real easily, can you? Anybody's ever tried to break open a coconut knows exactly what I'm talking about. Those bad boys are hard to get into, aren't they? So that's that single thing rather than the one that's easily broken open. That was good, though. So, yeah, I love palm hearts personally. And I like veggies and fruit. Have you figured that out yet? And that is actually the center portion. So that would be a live area of the xylem, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
The palm heart would be live xylem. And that's why they're called a softwood instead of a hardwood. Oh, man, this is all starting to make sense. Hardwoods are things like pines and... Actually, I'm not sure if a pine's a hardwood. But things that like oaks, that was good. Like oaks, maples would be a hardwood.
Is that a hardwood?
Yes, that's a hardwood. Whereas palms are considered a softwood in Florida science. When you're actually classifying different hammocks of trees, they're considered a softwood, and it seems to me the pines are a softwood too. And so they're... Although a pine gets much harder on the inside than a cabbage palm does. A cabbage palm stays moist in the inside.
So it's determined if it's hard or soft because of the inside?
Apparently.
Okay.
I wasn't sure why, so it's got to do with, yeah. And I've eaten plenty of cabbage palms. And you don't have to do them when they're little to get that. You can cut down a big cabbage palm, and if you go into the heart where the leaves are coming out of, now it'll be hard down low. Down low it'll look like regular wood. But up high, if you cut it where the leaves are coming out of, that's where the heart is that people eat.
Okay.
Okay?
So only cabbage palms have that?
As far as I know.
Okay.
That's a good question. I wonder if anybody's ever cut down a coconut tree to see. See, we have so many cabbage palms here in Florida that people eat them. But you know, the ones you buy in the store, they're not from here.
No.
No. And it's a lot of work. I did it once. They kept telling me you could eat cabbage palms, and my parents never bought one. And my dad kept saying, you can eat these things. And I'm going, well, let's do it, you know. I was about your age. I was probably about 15 or 16. And he kept saying, well, you cut one down and we'll eat it. He should have never said that to me. So one day while I were out hunting, I got the axe and I picked the cabbage palm near the water pump, which was really stupid. But, you know, I was from the city and I didn't know any better. And I go out there and I'm cutting down this cabbage palm tree. So when he gets home, I got this tree laying there. First off, he goes, why'd you cut the one next to the pump down? That wasn't the brightest thing in the world, because it could have crushed the pump, and then you don't get shade next to the pump anymore. It was kind of dumb all the way around. But the other thing is, he goes, why'd you pick such a big one? Why didn't you just pick a small one? It would have been a lot easier. I'm like, oh. You know, I'm thinking that it's got to be big for it to have a heart to you know, harvest. But apparently it doesn't have to. The really sad part about that whole story is then they proceeded to eat it one night when I was out.
You didn't get to eat it?
No. I was so mad.
You should have gone and cut down every cat.
Oh, no, man, it was way too much work. So after that, somebody told me you could buy them in the store in cans. Yeah, my dad didn't make anything easy. So, anyway, but that's my cabbage palm story. Okay, woody stems. Woody stems on page 447. So let's look at the woody ones. Now, he shows us a microscopic image of a woody stem. And guys, there's no blue wood that I know of that's been stained. I just want you to be aware of that. When you look at the slides today, they've also been stained. And it just makes it easier for us to see. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. Some of these slides are very difficult to see the stem. So if you have difficulty, please call me over and I'll try to help you, because they're very hard to get focused on. Okay? But this is a microscopic one. Let's look at the parts about this. The outside edge is the bark. You guys have all done bark. No big deal. And inside the bark That's the outer bark and the outside, and then you've got the inner bark, which makes up a large portion of that picture. And the phloem is actually in the inner bark. Remember, the phloem, okay, so it's carrying the stuff down from the leaves down to the roots and the rest of the plant. The cork cambium is between the inner and outer bark, and it produces cork cells, which are impermeable to water. You know, corks float on water because it's cork. And so it's impermeable to water, keeps the water in, it keeps the parasites out. So this is why a tree that's a woody tree can actually grow year after year after year and continue to grow. And if they ask you, well, why does bark crack? Why does bark crack? Because the tree grows, right? I mean, it's easy. The tree grows, the bark cracks. It has to, so the tree can grow. Then look at the very inside. It shows pith in this one. And then around the pith, it shows you xylem. And the xylem are the straws coming up, and the phloem is the stuff going down, carrying the stuff down. And the vascular cambium, which is the layer right in between the two, produces the new xylem and phloem as the tree needs it. Okay? Now, on the next page, page 448, he actually talks about all that stuff. And he talks about the growth rings in a tree. Oh, we got to erase all of our monkey faces and our donuts here. Now, let's look for a minute. The xylem is the inside of the woody stem, and the phloem is around the outside of the woody stem comparatively. Xylem's in the middle. That's the straws. They're dead once they mature. The phloem has to stay alive. That's the live stuff on the outside edge. Now, the trick is this. Let's say in the spring when there's a lot of water, and it's just raining like crazy. April showers bring May flowers, all that stuff, okay? Let's say it's a normal place, and you get a lot of water in the spring. The tree actually lays down bigger xylem to carry all that water that's available. So as it grows its xylem, it makes big xylem. And then later on that year, in the summer, when it starts to get dry in other places, we have convection thunderstorms here, but let's say it gets dry after the spring and into the summer and into the winter, then you have smaller xylem being laid down. And the reason you have the smaller xylem being laid down is because there's just not as much water available. And then the next year, this is very small, okay, it's, you know, much smaller than what we can see with our eye. The next year, when the spring comes again and you get the spring rains again, then you get the bigger straws or the bigger xylem being formed. And then when the dry season comes again, you get the little xylem being formed. And after you get this year after year, it actually produces the rings that we see in a tree. And there's your rings. So what you see when you look, I don't know, I didn't count it, but what you see when you look, you're actually seeing the larger xylem and the smaller xylem of each of the growing seasons, and that's why it ends up macroscopically looking like the rings. Hang on just a sec. If you have a flood or you have a drought or you're not getting the normal seasons, your rings won't be normal. So even though this is a good way to count how old a tree is, it can be off if your seasons were off due to abnormal weather patterns. And they can actually look at the tree and tell where there were droughts and where there were floods and stuff like that because of how they grow. Also, if we look at this one's dead, so its bark's actually, the outer bark's actually fallen off, so we won't deal with that. Well, if you look at it this way, though, you can kind of see the straws going on, can't you? Okay, because that's, and you can see where the xylem actually was like little straws that carried the water up. Now, if you wanted to kill a tree, and you didn't want to do it quickly like my little brother with his chainsaw. If you wanted to kill a tree, well, matter of fact, I'm going to give you a little story on this one too. When my husband and I moved up to the Ocala area, the Lord blessed us with a beautiful 5-acre piece of property, but it was full of oak trees, which is not the problem I have in Naples, okay? But it was full of oak trees. And the problem with that is I have horses, and so I want grass. And so I need sunshine to get to the ground to have grass. And so when my husband would go to work and I was home homeschooling the kids, when we had spare time, I would go out there and try to get rid of all the little trees. I'd leave all the big oak trees, but all these little oak trees that were blocking my grass, I was trying to get rid of them. And after trying to dig a few of them out and realizing that was way beyond me, because these were, you know, trees that had stumps about, they were too big for me to go over with my John Deere lawnmower, okay? Those, I was like, you know? My husband says I could kill things better than anybody knew. But if they were about that big, which means my John Deere wouldn't go over them, I had to somehow take them out, and I tried to dig them out. That didn't work. So then I got out there with a saw and started sawing them off at the ground level, because I was desperate to get rid of these trees and get some grass, because horses are very expensive if you don't have grass. And we didn't have a lot of money, and I'm out there sawing away these trees trying to clear this piece of property. Well, the problem is, when the rainy season came, the dirt would move from around them, and all of a sudden you have stumps about this high everywhere. These little stumps, so you can't even walk around, because now the tree's not there to warn you, and you're stomping all over all these stumps. It was terrible. And they grew back. There's enough photosynthesis going on in the stem that they just grew new leaves and said, oh, thank you for pruning us, and came back with a vengeance, which was terrible. So after we'd been there about a year or two, we had the horses there in a small paddock, then they didn't let it slow them down. All of a sudden I noticed the huge pine trees in the horses' paddock were dying. Huge! And I'm going, how did that happen? And I walked out there and I pushed on one and it fell over. I mean, this is a tree, you know? And I go, huh, and it goes thunk. And I'm going, man, I'm doing something wrong with those little ones, because my horses know how to kill them. They were girdling the trees. They were standing out there bored with nothing to do, so they would literally go around and eat all the bark from around the trees. And in the process of eating the bark, they were girdling the trees, which means they were eating away the phloem, which was the inner bark. And once you eat away at the inner bark, if you take the inner bark from all the way around the tree, you can't do it half of it because it'll keep going on one side. But if you do it all the way around, what happens is you still get the water and the minerals going up, but now the roots die because the roots aren't getting the nutrients from the leaves. And if you kill the roots, guess what happens? Big trees, they just fall over and die. Which I was like, oh, my horses are so much smarter than I am. You know, because they had this down. They cleared their paddock. I should have just turned them loose on the whole place. It would have been taken care of. And my husband and I have actually used that technique to get rid of a big pine tree that was too close to the house. And it's very expensive having trees removed when we were living in another location. And I said, girdle the tree. And he did. He girdled the tree, and it takes about a year. And by the grace of God, it didn't just fall over like when the other one did in the horse's paddock, because it would have hit the house. That one came down in pieces, which was a good thing, because it was a large pine tree. We were worried a hurricane would knock it over on the roof. But it came down in big branches full at a time. It was one of those trees that you didn't stand under because you never knew when something was going to fall. And there were big branches coming down. But the point is that girdling thing works very well because it kills the roots. So then you're not left with this stump that's going to come back, which was my issue. You actually take out the tree, but it takes time. Usually it takes about a year, but it will eventually kill that tree, and then you can remove it. Now, a lot of you live in places where you'd go, why would you want to kill a tree? But there are places where you do need to get rid of some trees, and so this is one of the means that you can do that. Okay, on page 449, he talks about specialized stems. Bulbs are like onions, are actually underground leaves. That explains a lot, doesn't it? That onions are underground leaves, and that's why you peel them back one leaf at a time.
What's the use of underground leaves?
To the plant, storage. It stores. That's why we eat them.
And that's why they aren't green, because it's no...
Yeah, because they don't have to photosynthesize. The green part's above. And then tubers, it says, are roots that store, and we eat those. That would be like your... It says another stem that's mistaken for a root is a tuber. So that would be like your potato, which is an underground stem that also does storage. So let's see. Then we go on. We don't have time for that, so we're going to go on. And let's flip over to page 452. Here we do the classification of plants. Now, there's a basic classification of plants. Plants are either vascular plants, which what did I tell you to think of on a plant when you hear vascular? Xylem and phloem, right? Okay. Or there are non-vascular plants. And these guys don't have xylem and phloem. And so they have to be small because they don't have a system to carry the water and the nutrients around. And so what is the one classification we gave to these non-vascular plants? What's the common name for them? Well, bryophyta is their technical name. Mosses. Who said mosses? Good job. Bryophytes, and good job for those of you that remember bryophyte. Am I spelling that right? Just making sure. Bryophytes, their technical name is bryophyte, but their common name is mosses. Mosses aren't very big, are they? They're very small. And that's because they don't have vascular systems to carry the nutrients and the water up and down, so they have to stay small. To be a large plant, you want it to be a vascular plant so that you have the xylem and the phloem to carry things around. There are non-seeded vascular plants, and there's two groupings that we saw here in the classifications. One makes spores. What did we call the spore producers? That was a vascular plant. Does anybody remember the common name for pterophyta? Ferns. Remember that? Ferns. And if you think about it, ptera means wing, phyta means plant, winged plant. Their fronds look like wings, don't they? So pterophyta. And they are a spore-producing, non-seed vascular plant. And then the rest of the vascular plants that we'll look at do make seeds. And so the one that it told us about made cones. Does anybody remember what its technical name is, the ones that make cones? Good, Coniferophyta. They're conifers. Coniferophyta. Hope I'm spelling that correctly. Because they make cones, right? And then the last one was the flower bearers, the ones that make flowers, Anthophyta, which we're going to spend the whole next chapter on Anthophyta because they're more interesting and there's a lot of them. Okay? So these are your conifers. A lot of us would think of pine trees and evergreens. These are your flowering plants. And then these are your ferns, pterophytes, and your bryophytes. Now, the other thing that you're supposed to know about these are on page 453 in figure 1414. He describes the alternation of generation. And the alternation of generation is this. What you need to know about that is when a plant goes through an alternation of generation, it has multicellular diploid phases and multicellular haploid phases. Why that's so different is, like with animals, the haploid phase is the egg and the sperm. It is never multicellular, is it? Okay? But with plants, they can have a multicellular haploid phase. And so it shows us here that when you have these haploid male and female version, which is the antheridium, which is the male, and the archegonium, which is the female, those are haploid. If you looked in them, if you'll remember, that means they have one of each of the pairs of chromosomes. They don't have a pair. They have one. They're haploid. And then they make an egg and a sperm by mitosis, because that's all they have to do is mitose, don't they? They come together, and those two produce the sporophyte generation, which is a diploid individual. That individual will make spores, okay? It'll go through meiosis and make spores that are haploid, and that'll grow the haploid generation. So that won't come together immediately like in animals. It'll actually make a haploid generation that'll grow up and go through this again, which I don't know about you, I found this very interesting and confusing, okay? And so if you do too, I understand. It's very different. Whatever generation it stays in the longest is called the dominant generation, and whatever generation it stays in the least is the, it's not the dominant. So with the mosses, the Gametophyte generation is the one you see the most, so that is the dominant generation. Whereas with the ferns, turn to page 455, the ferns, it's actually the sporophyte generation, and that's pictured actually on page 456. The fern, the sporophyte generation, is actually the dominant generation. But once again, it goes through this alternation of generations, and that's described there. And it shows you, you guys have probably seen the spores on the backside of the fern leaf. I looked for them yesterday, and I couldn't find any because I wanted to show you. But they're there at certain times a year. And then on page 457, it starts into the Coniferophyta and the Anthophyta, and pollen is actually the dust that holds the sperm in the sexual reproduction in these plants. Now, it has there for you a picture of a seed cone and a pollen cone, and I just went out doing this yesterday for you. I molested a pine tree. And the pollen cones, I really think this is new growth, but the pollen cones, that's what they look like on the edge of the pine. They'll look like this. And actually, these were in full bloom not that long ago, and most of the pollen cones have now fallen off. That's why I think that's actually new growth. These are the dead pollen cones. And if you see these all over the ground, these were the pollen cones on your pine trees that have fallen off, and they were on the edge of the tree, and they didn't look that shriveled. And that was where all that horrible yellow dust was coming from that went all over everything that was pollen. Okay, so hang on just a sec. So these would be right at the edge of this where these are now, and they look a lot like the pollen cones, but I know that that's probably new growth. But this is what they look like on the edge of the tree. These would be your pollen cones. Now on usually the same tree, you also find seed cones. And when they're on the tree, they're closed usually until they're pollinated. And then once they're pollinated, or once certain things are met, then they'll open. And when they open, they distribute the seeds. And the pine nut actually is a very cool looking nut that comes out of here. And then the squirrels go crazy because I love those things. But anyway, so this one still has the pine nuts in it. You could actually take this home, put it in it's heat, I think, and you put it in the oven, not too hot, so you blow up the place, but and if it opens, the pine nuts are in there.
Can you eat
okay?
it?
Oh, I know some people do. My dad was telling me he used to as a kid. But then my dad was basically starved as a kid. So they lived on the mustard greens out in the yard type of thing. Seriously. So on page 457, so when he's telling me this story last night, my mom's going, I don't think I ever ate pine nuts. And I go, well, Mom, you bought them at the store, I'm sure. They have them at the health food store. And my dad's going, no, those are pranoli nuts. And I'm going, no, I think those are pine nuts. I think they actually sell pine nuts. But anyway, so that shows you the pollen cones and the seed cones. And they are different. And then on page 458, it tells you the cotyledon is the seed leaf, and it also provides nutrients. Everybody here at some point in time has broken open a lima bean or a peanut, I'm sure, and you've seen how it splits into two pieces. That is the two seed leaves. Those, if you grew that as a seed, those would come out and go like this. That's a dicot. So you can break it in half, and it does provide nutrients for the baby plant, the embryo. A monocot would be peas or corn, where you can't take it and break it in half. It's one seed leaf. And if it came up, it would actually only make one leaf. But they don't separate very easily, okay? Remember that the monocots have parallel venation, dicots have netted venation, monocots tend to have fibrous roots, dicots tend to have tap roots. It tells us here on page 458 that monocots tend to have groupings of flowers in 3 to 6, whereas the dicot, the petals on their flowers, are in groups of 4 and 5. So there are definite differences. You need to be able to list a few of those for your test. Yes?
With the pine cones, how do they reproduce? Is it the pine cone that starts the reproduction, or? The
pollen cone produces the pollen, goes in the wind to the seed cone, and then we're going to study that in the next chapter. And then the pollen gets to the seed cone, produces the seed, and then it's released. We are studying that in detail, painful detail, in the next chapter. Everybody turn to page 461 for just a minute, please. I think we've gone over most of this. Remember, for the alternation of generation, you just need to know that the life cycle has a multicellular diploid and haploid stages. That's all you need to know for that. Dominant generation is the one you see the most of, or lasts the longest. Pollen, remember, is just the dusty stuff with the sperm in it from a plant. Cotyledon is just the seed leaf. You should know it provides food for the embryo, but that's what it is. Number 2, where it asks for the portion that produces new stuff in the plant, that would be the meristematic tissue. You should know that the blade is attached to the stem by the petiole. You see here that you have to be able to identify these leaf mosaics on the tree. Number 5, you're going to have to be able to name these shapes, the margins, and the type of venation that they have. The only confusing one I see there is E. He says that it is E is orbicular and it's undulate, but the point is that the veins, he says they're pinnate, even though to some people they look kind of parallel. And so I would give you credit either way on that. Just answer it as best you can.
Which one's the midrib?
It's supposed to be in the middle there, and I hate pictures like that. And there is one something confusing on the test. You just answer it the best you can, and I'm going to give you credit. Just make sure your answer is right by your, what you've studied. Okay. And then you have to know the 4 types of tissue. On number 6, you see there that you have to know that these tissues are either photosynthetic or their purposes for transport, for protection, for support. You need to know that what opens and closes on the stomata is the guard cells, that the lighter shade underneath is the spongy mesophyll. If the leaf was lighter on the top and the darker on the bottom, that means the spongy's on the top and the palisade's on the bottom. So you need to be able to think in those terms. You need to know the pigments and be able to, tell me that anthocyanins have multiple colors and the carotenoids have the 2, orange and yellow. You need to know on page 462 that a deciduous tree has has an abscission layer, so evergreen has no abscission layer, and that cuts off the stem and the petiole, so the vascular system gets cut off. You need to be able to identify the 4 parts of the root. Look at the pictures. I'm going to tell you right now on your test, you need to be able to identify it from the fibrovascular bundles. Be able to look at the bundles and tell monkey face, monocot, or not. Okay. On, let's see, 14, he asks what allows the woody stems to continue to grow. It's because they have bark, or you could put cork cambium or cork. The function of the vascular cambium is to make new vascular tissue. Anytime you hear cambium, think it's to make new of whatever tissue it's talking about. Okay? Is the stem, if it has cork cambium, is it woody or herbaceous? Woody, for sure. What kind of vascular tissue makes up most of the wood in a woody stem? Xylem, because that's mostly your straws, and what's on the outer part of the stem, which would be the inner bark, that would be the phloem. What is the dominant generation in moss? That would be the gametophyte generation, and remember, if it's the gametophyte, it's haploid. In the fern, he mentions the antheridium and the archegonium, which are the male and female of the gametophyte generation, and that is not the dominant generation in a fern. It is in a moss. So you need to know those. Why are plants from phylum Bryophyta smaller? Because they're not vascular, right? So they can't get very big because no vascular system. 15-foot tall tree has a root system that's only 4 feet deep. Which kind of root does it have? Fibrous, because a taproot is going to go way down. A fibrous root is like a little bush, and this is a 15-foot plant with a 4-foot root. That means it's a fibrous root. 22, what are the male and female reproductive organs in a coniferophyta, which would be your seed cones and your pollen cones? Fundamental differences between the monocot and the dicot. Monocot has 1 seed leaf, dicot has 2 seed leaves. And then you have to know some other differences, which we already discussed. A plant that produces seed cones and pollen cones, is it vascular? Yeah. And what phylum does it belong to? Coniferophyta. And then a plant that produces flowers, what phylum? Anthophyta. Flip back to the lab. Turn to page 450, please. 450 tells you what you're actually looking at. These are all fixed slides. You're going to be looking at the cross-section of a leaf. If you run short on time, that one's the one to let to the end, because that one is in your book. The picture is in your book. These other ones aren't, so look at those first. Look at the ranunculus root, Z-maze root, Z-maze stem, ranunculus stem. Do not sit there and draw all the little circles. You're not going to have time. Draw a representative of a couple circles here and then a couple circles there. Does everybody understand what you're trying to accomplish? Okay, so go ahead and start your lab now. I'm going to try to set up chloroplasts. Now wait a minute, before I lose you. I'm going to set up chloroplasts up here. I'm going to try, and hopefully you're going to see them move around. You're going to take your test and follow your syllabus into the first half of the next chapter, and you're going to bring flowers next week. Have a Jesus-filled week.